And I'm going to start sharing the PowerPoint presentation and make the introduction to the presentation for today. Alrighty then. Just want to confirm everybody can see my screen clearly.
Yep.
Awesome. All right, formally, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Asterix training series. Today we're going to be talking about the STARLIMS designer environment. And it'll be much more than the HTML and forms indicated on this main slide here. But we're going to go in to the, I'd say, on the at the 5,000 foot level, because there's quite an easy way to get down into the weeds with STARLIMS Designer, and that will come with experience and time, and you'll be able to navigate through that tool and not have any problems using it. But the trick, I think, is not to overwhelm folks at the onset. And I can tell you that that's something that I would have vastly appreciated when I first started taking my initial training with the STARLIMS system back in 2007. I think I may have mentioned in the previous training that at that time the version 10.0 was brand new. There wasn't even, it looks like it's automatically doing some stuff here. I didn't want to do that. The V10 product had a designer environment, but it was not IntelliSensed. There were quite a few bugs in the system. It was kind of hastily rolled out, if I may say. I think it's safe for me to say now 15 years later, that at the time the technology wasn't quite mature. Well, now it's very mature, and we still have quite a few instances of complexities that really, at the starting level here, at the 5,000 foot level, you don't need to know about quite yet. So hopefully the point at the end of this training is that you'll have a good understanding of how the system works, what it looks like, what you might need to look at in terms of designer and in terms of creating functionality as new LIMS consultants using STARLIMS. And I'm going to open up at the back end for any questions you may have. And we might even be able to do some actual live use of the system so you can see how it's used. It's pretty quick to show how that works. So we're going to do, these are the training objectives. Everybody here is very well qualified to use the system. And this is going to be about, I'd say, close to an hour maybe by the time we're all done with this. We're going to look again at the STARLIMS Designer overview, how to launch it, from where it is launched in the STARLIMS system, and how to access it. We spoke a little bit yesterday about features, users for licensing. And unless someone has been, one, created in the system as a user, and then two, assigned a designer license using one of the MHD mobile and HTML designer licenses, that person would not have access to the designer in STARLIMS. We're going to look at the actual interface. We're going to look at what we call server scripts in the STARLIMS environment, SSL. We're going to look at how SSL is used to populate controls and to provide functionality with manipulating the data on the server side. We're going to look at how some of the controls on a form are populated with a data source. Then we're going to go through a little basic exercise on, well, I don't know why this thing's auto-forwarding like that. It's weird. I should be able to stop that. But in any case, we'll look at creating a panel, standard form, and we'll look at some of the controls that you can drop on a control and what they're supposed to do. The most popular ones, I'm going to try to limit. There's a broad scope of controls, but we're going to try to limit it to the most popular ones. I think that would be a sufficient foray into your training for today. And then we'll look at tiny little bit the .NET code, what happens behind a control, and then writing and reading data to and from the STARLIMS database. These will be basic examples, but I think it's necessary for you all not to get overwhelmed at the onset because it can be discouraging otherwise. Let's get started. So the first things first, I think I mentioned it before, a STARLIMS Designer Developer License. The MHD type license must be installed in the STARLIMS system. And we spoke about that yesterday with regard to accessing the instance URL with the register.aspx link. And that takes you to the registration page for the licensing, and it'll show you whether you've got an MHD type license installed and how many users are available for that. In addition to the system license, the specific user attempting to launch the designer must be assigned access to the design environment using features users. It's performed by a STARLIMS system administrator. Now, I'm not sure if you can see this very well. It's kind of small, and I'll show it in the live system. But we can see our MHD license, and there's 4 of them there. And I've assigned myself, of course, within our system as an assigned user for an MHD license. This provides me access to the designer link, which we're going to get to next. So here's the designer link within the main menu on the left-hand portion of a STARLIMS system. You know what? Maybe what I should do is also come back over here to the live system. Can you see that? Can you
Yeah,
all
we
see
can.
that? Okay,
Yes.
awesome. Yep. So it's within the main menu, and it appears on the left-hand side of a STARLIMS system. And you can do a quick search for that once you guys have access, if you don't already, to the VM. And so there's our designer link. So a little sidebar note, when you click on the link itself, it replaces whatever tab you have opened here with the application that you clicked on. If you click on this little tiny sublink, it'll open up a new tab and not close the current session. So that's a little thing you might want to know there, a little tidbit of information. Click on, I would recommend using the side link over here. Okay, and that's what it looks like. So when you open the designer, you'll be presented with this form. We're going to go over each of the panes available in this form and the functions available within each pane. And I'm not sure if any of you have used Visual Studio way back in the day and even later iterations of that application, but it sort of mimics that functionality with the ability to select entire objects, categories on the left-hand side, and then you can look at these categories here for server scripts and STARLIMS and client scripts. These are definitely STARLIMS specific. And as you open these categories on the left-hand side, you will have additional options that will be presented on the right-hand side over here. Here, I blew it up a little bit for you now. So under the applications category, you'll see that in the previous pane, I expanded it out. I have some stuff out here that shows some categorizations and some groupings for the specific types of objects that occur within the category. And this is developer stuff, obviously. And my initials, I created a category for myself. And beneath that, it's an application, actually. DRP is called an application. We have these subsections, HTML, the server scripts, the client scripts, data sources. You won't be utilizing phone forms and tablet forms. Not that you need to know too much about that yet. The majority of what you will be doing will be working with this HTML forms. And in an XFD, that is a version 11 type system, STARLIMS system, you'll also have a category above HTML called XFD forms. For now, we're going to be looking at HTML forms. And I have a couple of forms listed beneath that. Each one of these represents an actual form in that HTML forms category. Client scripts and server scripts and data sources. It really is trying to play a song here. It's doing this on its own. I apologize for that. So this is the file menu debug pane at the top. We have save buttons. We have a play button. So if you have a form loaded here in the front and you hit this play button, it'll actually run it. And you can actually see it in your designer environment. And you can debug it using that. And it's standard cut, paste, copy, and delete buttons. And we have the ability to comment and uncomment code and shift and left shift entire blocks of code if you highlight them, excuse me. And for debugging, we have the ability to mark and unblock sections of the numbers on the on the left-hand side. There's also a debugger incorporated in the tool, and that would be operated from this icon. And it enables you to literally play through some of the code behind in the scripts, and it'll open up a secondary window that shows yellow highlighting as you're going through the code, and you can step through it just like anything else. That's what these controls do over here. And then when placing controls and objects on the forms, and we'll get to that soon, these are the alignment buttons that you can utilize for multi-selecting groups or multiple controls and make the form nice and neat and looking and adjusted and regimented looking. And then you have standard arrangement positioning on the form where you've got multiple controls and you might want one to appear in front of the other in the hierarchy of the object selectability features. So this is move to front, move to back. This is your main design pane. All of the work that you're going to be doing with regard to visualization of your forms and objects and controls will occur in this area. Now, right now it's devoid of anything, but when we create a form, you'll see that it'll actually appear in here in a kind of a grid pattern, and that there is the typical type of snap to grid functionality that enables these controls to be aligned even by hand if you have to do it that way. But it'll all be done within this design pane. So this is the category content pane I mentioned earlier. It is from this pane that you will select your initial application entity. You'll create new categories as you need them. And then within the categories, the system automatically creates these default types of controls for HTML, phones, tablets, server scripts, client scripts, or data scripts. These are always in place when you create a new application. And then you add, once you've opened the application, which appears over on the right-hand side over here, this example shows DRP. I opened this application and it appears over in the Explorer. So now we can see my forms and the other types of categories that occur within an application. These are the actual forms that I've created within this test application. The category selector pane allows us to jump between the application selector, and then there are system server scripts that are utilized throughout the STARLIMS system that are part of the core system, and those will appear inside of the server scripts category. Client scripts are essentially user-side code behind modules that can be called and used throughout the system from any form, from any system, from any application. They're not limited to just the application that you've created. In this example, I have my DRP application, and there are client scripts that are associated specifically with my application. So if I were to take my application and move it to a different category or move it as a group, all of my associated sub-objects would move with it. In this example, client scripts are associated again with the entire STARLIMS system, the core system, and not necessarily related to a given application. The same with server scripts. Data sources, those are SQL statements that are written in either standard SQL for the environment that you're in, if you're in an Oracle environment or a Microsoft SQL environment. And additionally, there are STARLIMS script syntaxed, that's a thick word, data sources, which use STARLIMS SSL to generate dynamic data and generate dynamic SQL statements based on parameters that may be sent to it from the outside. You will get into that, of course, in a more advanced training. The table manager over here, I don't want this thing to come off, will also expand out and show you all of the tables that are in the STARLIMS system. There are probably over 400 tables in the STARLIMS system, the majority of which have to do with users, tests, sample types, containers, sites, service groups, things like that, that are high-level, large capacity tables. And then there's all sorts of minutia data that is related to the sample workflow for dynamic data storage, the results tables, any of the analytes that are associated with those tests that are defined for the system. All of those tables are managed within the table manager. Then we have the reports manager section, and the reports manager section contains things like crystal reports and advanced analytics templates. We won't be describing too much of the analytics functionality. That's a separate training altogether. But STARLIMS handles advanced analytics templates, and those are templates that appear in this center section of the STARLIMS dashboard pane. It's not implemented in our Asterix LS environment, so we don't see any templates that appear there via advanced analytics. Those are managed within the reports manager down here. So this is a dual function pane on the left-hand side of the screen here. The enterprise pane shows you all the controls that we're looking at right now. Additionally, though, we have this pane mode selector button where we go between the category selector and the toolbox selector. The toolbox selector toggles between all of the controls, form types, any of the objects that you can drop on a form. And we're going to be looking at that a little bit later. I didn't drop it in the slides where it should be right in this particular part of the conversation, but we will see the toolbox and we will see all the tools that are appearing in there, and we'll give a small demonstration on how to load those onto a form and use them. So during your sessions with the designer, you're going to be exercising SQL statements, you're going to be running forms, you're going to be generating server scripts that produce output, that manipulate data, etc., ad nauseum. And when you perform those tests, the output will appear in this results pane, essentially. Officially, I think it's known as the output results message pane. So, for example, if I execute a SQL query within the design environment, the results will appear on the results tab within this white area. If I want to do, for example, a search in all of my code or in the entire system, looking for specific code or instances of code, you will be doing that in instances where you're coding in an environment, let's say for a customer, and you're trying to debug a problem, and there may be an instance of code that appears and you don't know necessarily quite what it's supposed to be doing or how the functionality has been set up to work. You can actually take sections of that code and plug it into the global search utility that we have inside of the designer, and it'll go out and find any and every instance of that code being used somewhere else in the system, and it'll give you examples. So, excuse me, a great period of time will be spent within the designer literally reverse engineering how it is that something is being handled within the STARLIMS system. So, I mean, a short example of that would be to come, let me see if I can stop this. One moment, I'm going to stop the recording for a moment because this auto forwarding situation's got to stop. My bad. Okay, so moving on. After finding results anywhere in the system, they'll appear down here in this area. So when running an application in your design environment and debugging it, there will be many instances, I can tell you firsthand, whereby what you think would be working isn't working for some strange reason, and you'll get some ugly error on the screen. You'll learn to read them, you'll learn to understand them, and the main tool to do that is to go over to this server log area. I can use my little laser pointer, right? Yeah, the server log area. When you click on that, we'll see a detailed listing of any variables that may be missing or misdefined or improperly defined, or any number of different scenarios whereby even syntactically missing a semicolon at the end of your server script line, which is a line termination character in STARLIMS. If that's missing, the most wonderfully written code in the whole world will come to a crashing halt. And sometimes it's not easy to spot that. You've got hundreds and hundreds of lines of code, and you may have copied something from another location into your code when it was working fine over there, but when you copy pasted it, you missed that last little semicolon and you pasted it into your new code, and now it's crashing and you don't know why. Well, that's where you're going to find it in this server log. So STARLIMS also has a check-in, check-out system. Whenever it did it again, it's still forwarding. Weird. I don't know how to stop that. So when you're in a form, you'll see that it appears green. You've got it checked out. That means it's checked out to you. And there's a check-in, check-out system. And we'll look at that in the designer later on when we do the live example. And that prevents other folks, folks from changing the code on you or modifying it in any sense. There is a code history that is associated with every single object that you create in the system, and you're able to go backwards and forwards in those iterations of the versions of those objects. When you click the Pending Check-ins tab and hit the refresh button on there, you will see all of the objects that are checked out currently for you, and you have an optional button that will show all objects that are currently checked out by anybody. So there are times when you're going to be in a system and you're working with multiple developers, and it shows up that you need to come up here and edit something that all of a sudden shows up as a red item in this list, and you know that someone else has it checked out. You'll go down to this pending check-ins, do a refresh with all users selected, and you'll see the name of the person that has it checked out. You'll be able to give them a phone call. So when you have a form open and an object selected, for whatever object you might have selected, there will always be this properties pane populated with all of the methods and properties and values and events that are associated with that control in this lower right-hand pane, the properties pane. The I can't speak English today. Workspace Explorer pane allows you to expand, add, modify, delete, rename all of the objects within an application that you may be working with. And there's a big fat view of all of the panes together. So in previous trainings, the STARLIMS system was mentioned. We want to use the same general components required by most web applications. There's a client-side UI, the front end. We have a server-side component, which is known as the back end. And then we have data source queries and the alternative section for reports and advanced analytics. So all STARLIMS development activities within those components are performed within the STARLIMS designer. The client side, the front end, that hosts all of the forms and the controls and the client side scripting that occurs on those forms. In STARLIMS, we refer to that as the JScript code behind, and that occurs behind every control, behind every form, and behind every data source. There are all sorts of different factors related to the scripting code, which executes in these forms. We're going to look at that in the designer towards the end. Data sources, that's how we affectionately call the code blocks that perform the data calls from STARLIMS clients and the server script to the server database. And we send data, we send requests, we get requests, we can send inserts, selects, anything that relates to a SQL statement. We do that from the data source control. On the server side, we have this STARLIMS scripting language, otherwise known as SSL. It'll always be referred to within the server STARLIMS environment as SSL. And that is a proprietary STARLIMS server-side language, and we do all of the processing of the data on the STARLIMS server. It doesn't occur anywhere else. Client workstations communicate with the STARLIMS server across the web or whatever connectivity is set up. With these latter versions of STARLIMS, we have the V12 environments mostly operating on the cloud now. So your database administrator, your remote system administrator from the STARLIMS environments, and the sales representatives have set that all up. You'll be communicating through the servers, and all of the data occurs between the clients and those servers across the cloud. So data sources in STARLIMS really consist of standard SQL statements, those that you would execute in Microsoft SQL or Oracle. And we do standard select statements, and we do standard inserts, and we do updates and deletions, as it were. So here's a really simple example of a server-side SSL script. And it's a fully functional server-side script, and we would parameterize it. We could send in parameters from the UI on the client side, and we call the server script, sending it two parameters. In this case, I've provided two defaults because we're going to be playing with this in the example, and we do a standard numeric assignment. STARLIMS is a loosely typed language. You don't have to define a specific type of data type for a variable. It is presumed or assumed by the system based on the value that is being assigned. So we know that param1 will be a numeric value. We're also going to declare two variables, x and y, and again, we don't have to data type them. Right now, they're just open objects. And based on the assignment, using the colon equals operator here, we're assigning a numeric value of 5 to x because param1 was assigned a default value of 5. So now x equals 5. Y is equal to 8 using the same construct, and the server script will return x times y. You'll get your multiplication product there. Within the STARLIMS system, we have a pretty extensive help system, and so you can go into the server-side SSL reference, and we'll see, what all of these commands do. Here's a simple statement for SQL where we had our previous XY from the previous example here. We're not actually going to use XY in the next environment here, but we do have a new one called SSQL. And we do use standard naming conventions for any of the variables in STARLIMS. These, therefore, X and Y should have been IX or IY for integer, or NX or NY for numeric. Here we've got SSQL for string. And we're assigning a simple select statement to the string. Select star from the users table in STARLIMS. We're going to return the value returned from the SQL statement using the SQL execute command. You don't have to memorize any of this stuff yet, but it's just an example of how it works. And then we return the value that was executed by this statement here in an array. So SQL execute in STARLIMS actually returns an array of values based on this SQL statement up here. And then we simply return vals. And down here you'll see in our results pane that this, it's wrapping, of course, because it doesn't all fit within the screen. This is actually an array, and you can see on the left-hand side there's some brackets there that indicate that's the beginning of the array. And then each line item within the array represents another array, which indicates the elements contained within the row that was returned from the SQL statement. So later on in JScript and in the server script manipulation of data, we can pull out just the elements that we're interested in seeing and pass those on to a control that's visible on a STARLIMS form. So the high-level route that occurs is we perform a data request from the STARLIMS application on the screen. We've got an application running that has, let's say, a button, and the button wants to, let's say, drag down some information from the users table to populate a data grid. This is what this representation is here, where number 5 is. So the data request goes out. The STARLIMS server accepts that request. It then generates a server-side SQL query statement, which goes to the STARLIMS database, which might be Oracle or Microsoft SQL. The requested data is built and then sent back to the server. The web application knows what to do with that data object coming back from the STARLIMS database server, builds it into an HTML dataset, and then repopulates the form on the screen with the data. So it's a round trip. And it happens very quickly. So forms and controls are used to create the client-side user presentation, and they occur within the designer environment panes that we looked at earlier. Let's take a look at some of those. The types of controls that we typically use in a STARLIMS environment are panels. The form is the actual base template canvas, if you will, onto which all other controls are placed. The form itself generally doesn't do anything other than it has some events associated with it upon loading, upon being initialized, upon accepting incoming parameters from another form that may have called the secondary form. So it does some of the high-level functionality associated with a form. But the interactive components of a form are always typically panels, group boxes, we have frames, we can split any one of these types of containers into multiple sections. We do horizontal or vertical splitters. It allows for moving data left and right or controls left and right without affecting the rest of the panel. There are all sorts of approaches to making the UI work the way we would like it to look. Within any of those groups, panels or frames or containers, we typically use data grids, list boxes, buttons, or links. There will be text boxes for data input. There will be combo boxes which allow, they can be configured multiple ways. You can either show a list of data that you can select from, or you can actually use it for data input, which would build to the list which is defaulted to that combo box. Text fields are like rich text fields. I'm sure you've seen all of those before. So an example of opening an application within the designer, here we have a dev environment, and look at that, we got Mr. Tan in there. We're going to open an application, and I utilized David's asterisk training as an application, and there we have our categories: HTML forms, server scripts, this phone and tablet forms for the mobile devices, client scripts, and data sources. So here I elected to create a new form. So if you try to expand this button in the designer and there are no forms, it doesn't do anything. However, we can right click on it and create a new form. So I created a new form called My New Form. And upon that, the designer displays immediately a form template. This has no functionality. It does nothing. It is basically the canvas onto which other controls will be dropped. So now we have the toolbox component of the left-hand pane well, I actually didn't select it for some reason, but anyway, I took a screenshot, so I apparently didn't quite get that right. But this toolbox will be active, and you'll see all of these controls appear. Now, I won't go over every single control, but we're going to go over a fairly hefty little component of it because these are the ones that we use most of the time. There are a number of ways to put controls on forms. You can either click on the panel or a control, whatever it is, and then come over here and draw it. You can draw it with your mouse, or you can just left click and drag it across, release, and it will drop the panel on the form. At that time, the properties pane for that control becomes active, and here we have a control that's going to be this is going to be a panel, I think. Yep, panel. So you'll see panel appear over here. Right now I have the main form selected, which is why we see form 1. Then we can drop a text box. We can go to another control and drop a text box right on this panel. And you'll see that once the text box is selected, the properties pane changes over to that control, and it shows you all of the properties and methods associated with that. We'll take a closer look at this in a moment. So here's a smattering of typical controls that are used on STARLIMS forms. We'll find text boxes. We'll find a group box, which contains a series of controls. And that's kind of a good thing to do occasionally when you need to manage types of controls related to user, for example, username, and they're going to have demographics. So name, address, city, state, zip would all occur within this group box. And if you needed to move that, rather than moving all of the controls together separately, I beg your pardon, you could move them all together by moving the group box control. They would just all move. And then you can align them and add the aesthetic component of a form. Within a context of a control of a group box panel, there might be the need, for example, to, and if there's more data that needs to be presented on a panel than will fit within the allocated area for a panel, you can put a splitter on there. And the splitter can be, one of the properties can be to allow it to grow. So you can have multiple controls in this area, and the splitter will allow you to move up and down and present the controls that exist below the point of visibility up and down. It's just another one of the methods of using a splitter or a control panel. Here's a combo box. It'll appear with the downward facing caret chevron. These have multiple properties allowing, for example, editing the actual value that appears, or a read-only mode which allows the user to select only the values which appear in that control. These controls are typically populated with a data source. So one of the options in the control itself, and we'll visit that shortly, is to populate the control from a data source. Here's a data grid. Oh boy, data grid. Again, populated by a back-end data source, and it's one of the properties and methods associated with the data grid to select which columns appear and which columns might be editable. It's still doing this auto forwarding thing. I'm so sorry about that, folks. Another example, similar to a combo box, is a list box. And a list box always appears in the size that you've formatted it in. For example, this one, I made a little rectangle out of it. And that might be the necessity for a given UI that you've designed. In other instances, it might be that you don't have enough room for a list box, and you opt to use a combo box, thereby dropping the combo box contents by hitting this button. Whereas this one appears with the list populated at all times. So here's an example of the text box properties. You've got the appearance control category, behaviors, whether or not using the tab key on your keyboard when executed multiple times, whether or not that control is one of the stopping points for the cursor, whether in fact it's visible. For the text box, it might be possible that the data that is shown in that text box might need to be defaulted to some value when the form is presented in the first place. Rather than coming up blank, you may need that data to be displayed from a default value. In this case, you would have the ability to set that right in this field here, the data member field. Every control has events associated with it. Not all controls have all events. Some don't make sense to have a control that other ones. For example, because it is a text box, and a click event would be associated with it, whereas a display only or read only type control wouldn't necessarily have the necessity to have a button click event. Then in that case, it wouldn't appear under these properties that show up here. Anchoring allows the control to be mated, if you will, to the containing object. So if we have a group box that has 10 controls in it, and you move the left-hand side of the group box. If you'd like all of the controls within that group box to move to the left and right as well when moving the left edge of the group box, then you can use anchoring to do that. And there are more controls further down here. So an example of what might happen within this text box control is we're going to set an on button click event, and double clicking on button click creates a code behind construct for the control, and it'll be named text box 1 or whatever you've named this control in its own properties, naming properties under the ID here. I left it as text box 1, and it builds the actual control construct. So text box 1 on button click event, which is able to receive event arguments, and it's also able to receive the name of the control that may have launched this button in code. For example, if we didn't click on it with our mouse click, we might have actually called this function from another control, and in that case, that sender control ID would be here. But here it's a very simple thing. When we click the button, we do an alert on the screen. Hello world. It's moving around on me. So here's an example of writing or reading from a database table in STARLIMS script. So let's say on click event in STARLIMS, we have a button, and on that on click event, we call the server script that inserts a new user into the users table in STARLIMS. Well, here's a standard SQL statement. We have our users table in STARLIMS, the 3 fields we want to affect, and we're passing values into that table. That's contained within this string. And then we use the SQL execute command, passing it the SQL string. That physically inserts the users table. And then we can next subsequently hit and update the SQL statement again. This time we're going to select star from users where username equals dpando. Obviously, when we execute that, we're going to get just the dpando record from the users table. And we are going to assign the return value from that SQL statement to this array variable, a return vals, and then we terminate this with return statement. And what will end up happening is, as we saw in the previous example in the results pane from the designer, the array that contains these values from the select statement. So we're doing an inline reassignment here. We're using s equal to insert. We're executing the statement, and then we're changing the value of the S SQL statement for the select. So this is an all-in-one, reading and writing from the database. So that actually concludes the designer overview training, the overview component of it. And we can do Q&A here, and we can do live session examples. I'm going to open up STARLIMS here and go to the designer, and we can play around with it to see how some of this stuff functions. I'm going to remove these controls because they're not really, they were just there for screenshots for mostly. Okay, so here's our new form, my new form. As you can see, these are green because I've got them checked out, and now we can actually see the live example of how the system works. Okay, I guess it just didn't want to redraw the grids, but that's okay. So here we have our basic form. I don't want to show anything you don't want to see yet here. Clear the screen. And we've got our controls on the left-hand side over here. I guess would be kind of a cool thing to show you how to load a data grid. So if we have a data grid control here, I'm going to select it. And I'm going to draw the data grid in the form where I want it to go. So the object is now on the form. It has no data associated with it, and there are no properties that have been manipulated outside of the default ones that come with the control itself when loaded on a form. So this is actually a good thing here. I loaded this panel on the form, and I loaded a data grid into the panel. So if I have a whole series of controls that I need to adjust somewhat, rather than going and adjusting every single one of the controls, just like any other standard UI in an IDE system, you can take this and move it around, and you can align your controls and give it the aesthetic qualities you want. For this data grid, I'm going to give it a different name. That is the default data grid name. Anytime you add a data grid to the control, and if I add multiple data grids, it'll continue to increment the numeric value at the end. But we're going to call it data grid main, or we'll call it data grid users, because that's what we're going to put in there. Now we want to load this data grid. Let's use the users table in STARLIMS as an example. We're going to take a quick peek over the enterprise over here. We're going to go into the table manager, and you'll see that users is one of the tables, and here's that very long extensive list of tables associated with STARLIMS. Not all tables in the STARLIMS system are used for every instance and application of STARLIMS. I mentioned yesterday that the STARLIMS system is a toolbox, and so it is used to build verticals such as forensics or pharmaceutical or petrochemical or clinical or for any number of different uses. And they don't limit the number of tables based on the vertical it's being used. The entire system occurs. And it has all the tables there. Not all of them are used. So in this example, we're going to go down and take a look at the users table. And we can browse contents. I'm actually right-click context menuing this. So that's how we're getting to browse contents. And here is the designer utility to view the contents of a table in STARLIMS. Sometimes there can be thousands, millions, if you will, records in some of these tables, so it limits the initial view to the first 10 records or so. In every single table within the STARLIMS system, there are two fields that are contiguous and pervasive. They are the ORG-REC table, the ORG-REC field and the ORG-STS, which is their old naming convention that was given by STARLIMS way back in the early 2000s. They just never moved away from them. But these provide obviously the unique key for the table, preventing duplication. Although there are other indexes associated with this table, this will always be pervasive and it will always be persistent. ORG-REC is always unique. The ORG-STS field is utilized in order to produce auditing when the auditing is turned on in the system, and it always comes on as an A. And if we want to see all of the records, we can put in a number of things here, greater than 3,000 if there aren't any in the users tables, as I know. Yeah, so these are the users that are with IDs greater than 30. Just for the sake of moving this over for ease of use, I'm going to move it over here. So we know we have records in the system just by doing this brief little browsing of the system, of the tables, values. And now we're going to generate a SQL statement that will drag data into this data grid. So we select our data grid. and we look for a method down here, a property called data. To generate a data source for this data grid, all we need to do is either click the ellipsis button or double click this data. And it gives us the opportunity to name the SQL statement, and we're just going to call it data source users using a standard convention. We have the choice of either creating a standard SQL syntax or creating a STARLIMS syntax. You'll get training on how to use this at a later point. For now, we're just going to use this standard SQL statement. It'll open up, it creates a new data source under the category for David Astrix training. And here's our data source object, and it gives me a blank template. In here, I can type in a standard select statement. And then we can run it using the run button up here. Got to save it first. And then in our results output here, now we see all of the records associated with that table. So now we have a data source. We're going to go back to our form. We've got our data grid selected. We can right click on the data grid. We can do root table designer. And now all of the fields that are associated with that data source appear as objects that we can select for the data grid, and you can see where they appeared here. In most instances, you won't be selecting every single column and every field from a table. You'll be looking at just a few specific ones, and you can come into each one of these things. They are also associated with these properties, and you can turn the visibility on or off, or you can remove them from the results for the data grid altogether. You will always leave the org rec field, if not visible, definitely has to be part of the data grid. That we'll go over that in a more detailed training for advanced training. Right now, we're just trying to show how to load the data in the data grid, and we save it. And so now we have all of the columns associated with that SQL statement being displayed within our designer data grid object. There are multiple methods upon running this form whereby the data will be populated into this data grid. So reset data, you wouldn't need to know that what it does right now, but we're going to set it to auto load. That will cause the data upon launching this form, it'll populate the data grid with the data from the SQL statement. We can actually run it at this point. What's going to happen at this point is it's going to hide this designer environment. It's going to go back over to the main screen and open up a new tab and load this data grid. At least that's what I'm expecting it to do. It's appearing in the size that we designed it for. So if we want to make it bigger, we go back to the designer. We'll close this form here. Give ourselves some space here. Let's do something here. I'll give you an example of anchoring. So we're going to cause this thing to fill. That's for docking. It's going to fill the entire interior of its containing object. In this case, it was a panel. And the next thing we're going to do is cause that panel to fill the entire interior of the form, its parent form. We're going to go back to the panel. And we're going to fill it there too. So now we'll save it and we'll reload the form. It should fill the whole thing out. Well, it didn't. Not sure why, but in any case, we do have a data grid and it is loaded with the user's information. And likewise, we can add additional controls, combo boxes, refresh statements, all involving commands that are set from the form on the client side to the server side using a call to the server script. The server script, for example, one we might do is have a button out here that, let's say somebody else on the other side of the building is adding users. Well, we're not going to see that new user in this form because it's only looking at the data as it existed when we loaded the form. But we put a refresh button up here and we click the refresh button. That re-executes the SQL statement, which gathers the data for this data grid and then reloads the data. So that's a brief overview of how the system actually works and what it looks like from the design aspect. I'm going to open up the floor for questions and we can go through as many exercises as you'd like. Anybody? So if no direct questions, does anyone have any comments about the their I'd actually like to hear some statements about your perspective on how this looks. On a scale of 1 to 10, do you think it's complicated? Is it overly complicated? Or how much more detail do you think we need to go into for the overview here? Any comments about that?
I think as an overview, it seems like a good start. Um, Probably one of the more helpful things was seeing all the different types of forms you can or fields you can put in. Um, and I think it's good that we didn't get too far into the weeds, just since it's sort of like the introduction the first time we're seeing this.
Yes. Alrighty then. Well, I think we've pretty much we're right on time. It's like 12:03 right now. It's at 10 a.m. your time, so it was supposed to be 60 minutes long, and we did manage to make it 60 minutes. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. Thank you, everybody, for attending. It was my pleasure to present this to you. And if you have any other questions, even as you proceed on in your tenure here with Asterix and doing STARLIMS work, please absolutely do not hesitate to reach out to myself. Of course, we have two other senior developers as well. That would be Julio Duarte and Ronel Manresa. And so we've been doing it a long time. And I can tell you, don't feel overwhelmed because it's just a long learning process and you will eventually get it. It's a very powerful tool and a great skill set to have, especially with Asterix requiring as many resources as we can get regarding STARLIMS projects right now. So the faster you get this on board, the better it's going to be for you and for Asterix. All right, I'm going to stop recording. Thank you.